Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. North Korea submitted its first voluntary national review to the United Nations and claimed the continued sanctions are among the main obstacles that are blocking North Korea from achieving a sustainable development. While North Korea seems to be blaming its economic troubles on everything but its own policies, the fact that North Korea admitted on the world stage it is facing a food shortage aroused curiosity. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Mr. Ruggiero served as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. Jin Lee also joins me today. Ms. Lee is Director of the Korea Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She was the first Pyongyang Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
First of all, in what is seen as a rare move, North Korea admitted in its report to the UN that it is facing its worst food shortages in more than a decade. Mr. Ruggiero, why do you think North Korea is making their difficulty known to the world?
Well, when it comes to humanitarian assistance and food assistance, when you hear the stories, they're truly heartbreaking. From my perspective, having worked on this issue, it certainly seems, it's a leadership decision. Again, the North Koreans have a certain amount of resources that come into the country, and the decisions by the leadership, the decisions by those around the leadership, to make the decision to essentially build nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles instead of feeding their own countrymen is really heartbreaking. I think at some point they expect others to fill in for their problematic decisions, and unfortunately, in this circumstance, I don't see that happening. So they'd be better off making decisions to put their resources where they truly are needed, which is with the North Korean people.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Lee, how did you take what North Korea had to say?
Well, I think we should at first acknowledge that the North Koreans submitted this report. I believe it's the first time they've submitted this report to the UN, and I certainly haven't seen it before. And at a time when we have so little contact with the North Koreans, it's almost like getting a message in a bottle to have them send this report and to see the leadership acknowledging the food shortages in this way. So much of the report is propaganda, and yet there are some hard truths that are coming through. I think it's very interesting. We should see this, in a sense, as perhaps a moment of outreach and hopefully a first step out of their isolation. They have been in self-imposed isolation for such a long time. And perhaps, and there's no way to know for sure, but perhaps it is part of a strategy, not only in acknowledging to their own people that they are going through hard times, but also in reaching out to the outside world through this admission of this food shortage. And the food shortage is nothing new, so we should keep that in mind as well.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Lee, North Korea's ambassador to the UN, Kim Song, said the continued sanctions and blockade on DPRK, severe natural disasters, and world health crisis are main obstacles in the efforts of DPRK to achieve the sustainable development of the country and improve the people's livelihood. In this claim, is North Korea asking for help, or is this part of its strategy to get sanctions relieved?
Yeah, that's very interesting. The way you've described it, the regime's narrative is always to blame forces beyond the leadership's control, to blame others for its suffering, when in fact it's its own policies that are largely to blame. I mean, it is true that they did not benefit from, they suffer from a terrible situation in terms of the climate, but most of the agricultural decisions and policies that they've made are their own. And then the decisions to invest in a nuclear program that brought on those sanctions, those are their own decisions. They certainly don't tell the people that. You will never hear that when you're inside North Korea. It's always painted as this hostile policy that was led by the United States, and then it's unilateral. So the regime inside the country never takes the blame for the decisions that have brought on these sanctions. And so it is a lot of propaganda, a lot of messaging, and a lot of trying to shape the narrative to their benefit. But I do think it's also a way to signal that maybe there's a potential opening here to engage the North Koreans, and that this is one way perhaps to reach them and bring them out of that isolation.
Right. Mr. Ruggiero, what is your thought? What is North Korea trying to say here?
As I noted, they're the ones who have made the decision to build nuclear weapons. They're the ones who have made decisions to use their banking channels for proliferation activities rather than allowing an open banking channel for humanitarian organizations, many of whom are not North Korean, obviously are not North Korean and care more about the North Korean people than the Kim regime. The quickest way is not submitting a UN report or something else. The quickest way is for the regime to give up its nuclear weapons program and its ballistic missile program. That's been offered to them multiple times. They were offered substantial benefits in the Trump administration. I'm sure if they engaged in a similar negotiation with the Biden administration, they'd get substantial benefits in return, and then they could finally move their country in the right direction, as opposed to when you compare North Korea and South Korea, you see the divergence of the two countries is quite stark. But that's really where North Korea is now. It's not so much about the specific question of food shortages or humanitarian assistance. Are they willing to continue down this path, which has nothing but suffering for the North Korean people and eventually for the elites? I mean, I'm sure we're all seeing what's happening in Cuba. It's happened in other countries, that at some point the people get fed up. And governments such as North Korea's have to make different decisions.
Mm-hmm. But Mr. Ruggiero, it seems like the North Korean regime is blaming its difficulties on everybody but themselves. How have sanctions really affected the North Korean economy so far?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, as a sanctions expert, I get from both sides. Sanctions never work, and then when reports like this come up, there's always the suggestion that sanctions are working too well. But I think there's an aspect in the middle of that. You read the UN panel of experts report, and it's clear that the North Koreans are evading sanctions through selling commodities and buying materials, none of which they're using again for the North Korean people. And it's clear that the sanctions need tightening in the sense of making sure that it doesn't go to their nuclear missile program. But again, sanctions across the board, U.S. sanctions, UN sanctions, have carve-outs for humanitarian assistance. The problem when it comes to the Kim regime is that when you provide that kind of assistance or that kind of channel, Kim regime abuses that and then uses that channel for proliferation activities or other prohibited activities, which then hurts the North Korean people.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Lee, the contents in the report that North Korea submitted seemed to be in line with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's recent warning to the North Korean people that the food situation is now getting tense. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but could this all be some political groundwork for the talks with the U.S.?
Yeah, I always, every time we see the leader speak or the leadership speak, I look at both the domestic intent and domestic audience as well as their foreign policy strategy. So I try to, because they're always trying to target both the people and the outside world. And I think with this statement, Kim Jong-un is acknowledging to his own people that he sees their hardship. It must be at a point, and again, we're not there. So it's hard for us to see how difficult things are, and the propaganda, the state media don't reflect that reality. And I can tell you that even in the best of times, it is extremely difficult for the average North Korean to get food on the table, to get medicine. It's just with the power outages, the lack of clean water, the lack of medicine, the lack of a good diet, it's tough all the time. And so I can't imagine how tough it's been with this border closure since January 2020. And so perhaps at this point, for him to acknowledge it like that, he just can't gloss it over anymore. And then I think also by acknowledging the food shortages and hardship publicly, he can then explain and justify the eventual acceptance of outside humanitarian help after he has said, we're doing fine, we can survive on our own. So I do sometimes look at whether these signals and these statements are setting the ground for eventual outreach, and I hope so.
The U.S. State Department has stressed the troubles North Korea has are of its own making, saying the regime continues to exploit its own citizens and divert resources from people to build up its unlawful nuclear and ballistic weapons programs. But Mr. Ruggiero, wouldn't North Korea's current situation provide all the more reason for the U.S. to make an effort in starting a dialogue?
Well, just on what Ms. Lee was saying, but I think when it comes to humanitarian assistance as well, the other point we haven't talked about is COVID-19, right? And there's probably the COVID-19 pandemic in North Korea that they're ignoring, or at least to the outside world ignoring. That's another set of assistance that could be potentially available. But all of this assistance, the real question, as all three of us know, is will the Kim regime allow that assistance to go to the North Korean people? And so, certainly, I think there's not a person on this planet, perhaps other than in the Kim regime, that wouldn't want to help the North Korean people. But it's hard for us, when many of us have been doing this for a long time, that we know that, when we set up all these, there's many NGOs, as I mentioned earlier, many governments, foreign governments, happy to provide that assistance, but without some kind of guarantee that it would go to the North Korean people, that becomes a serious problem. In terms of whether this is a signal for negotiations, we never know. But, I'm sort of a simple person in the sense of they don't have to send a complicated signal. They have a channel in New York that they can answer. They have other multitude of channels that they can either directly or indirectly to the United States get a message to us. The challenge, of course, is that, as we said during the six-party talks, a lot of times there was a debate over the size of the table rather than the core question of, is the Kim regime ready to give up its nuclear weapons program and its ballistic missile program? If the answer is no, it doesn't matter how they send the signal. There's not going to be any success, and the sanctions will remain. And frankly, there's a chance that they would increase. And so if they're looking for a way out of this, if they truly are, the way out of this is to make that decision to roll back those programs. And until they do that, any of these signals are going to be sort of lost amongst other issues that certainly are taking a higher priority.
Can I just jump in and say that I do think that while there's potential for COVID-19, the distribution of vaccines, which the North Koreans have not accepted, or even humanitarian aid to provide a way to engage the North Koreans, it's very tricky to do that in a principled fashion and sustainable fashion. What the North Koreans would want is for us to just hand things over to them to handle and to distribute as they see fit. And that would make it extremely difficult for donors outside North Korea to monitor and justify where the humanitarian aid is going. They haven't made the decision yet to open the border or even to open up to outside help. So we're not quite there yet, but I think it's very tricky. So it's not just a decision on the part of the United States or other donors. It is a decision that the North Koreans have to make, to agree to stick to and adhere to and maintain and follow through on all those delicate requirements of monitoring and accountability that come with accepting aid or vaccines or any other type of help.
In the meantime, the Wall Street Journal reported the Biden administration has nearly completed an extensive review of U.S. sanctions policy and could possibly decide to ease severe sanctions against adversaries. However, the State Department said sanctions on North Korea remain in place and it'll continue to enforce them. Mr. Ruggiero, what did you make of this news?
Well, when I read the Wall Street Journal article, the core thing that came through to me is that the Biden administration wants to focus more on multilateral sanctions. So sanctions that that the U.S. might impose on their own through our own authorities, but along with other countries. The rationale there is that they're more effective that way. This is not the show to have the philosophical debate of whether that's true or not, but I will note that in the case of North Korea, I suspect the reason why the State Department said there be no change is because there's already many UN Security Council resolutions, many of which, I think almost all of which, passed unanimously, which are obviously multilateral, and then a lot of the U.S. sanctions, some of which are above the UN requirements, but much of which is to implement the UN requirements. But as Jean said earlier, the core question here is implementation. That article is talking about what they're going to do going forward. To me, the real question when you read the UN panel of experts report, as I said, and there's 20 plus recommendations of things that need to be done, and frankly, that's not the only report. That's just this year's, or at least the one that came out this year, the annual report. There's many years before that which have just as many recommendations, and so to me, the question is also how are they going to implement these sanctions against North Korea?
Ms. Lee, will the Biden administration's review of sanctions affect the North Korea sanctions in any way?
I do hope the Biden administration sees sanctions as a diplomatic tool, as a tool that they can use in future negotiations and not just as a weapon for punishment and isolation, even though they are also meant to punish North Korea for illicit actions or actions that North Korea has taken in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. I don't know if that's how it's going to play out, but it needs to be seen, the sanctions need to be seen strategically. And as a tool rather than as just a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the existing North Korea sanctions by the international community, do you think they should be remained as they are right now?
Certainly, they should remain. They should be implemented. They should be looking at additional areas for sanctions. And as we sit here, it's about 6 months into the Biden administration. The North Koreans have not responded. The one thing that they have done is continue their nuclear and missile programs and other illicit activities that are prohibited. They're certainly not stopping their cyber activities. The fact that the Biden administration is doing a sanctions review is a good element of that. Certainly, sanctions are not and should not be punishment. They should be one element of a broader toolkit that's used. But if the diplomatic toolkit is not available right now because the North Koreans refuse to respond, the Biden administration can't just sort of walk away and engage in the second round of strategic patience like we had during the Obama administration and just sort of hope that things get better. You've got to engage, and certainly Sung Kim is engaging other countries outside of North Korea. But the other element of that has not happened yet is really trying to affect some of these programs, affect the inputs that are going into these programs, and that's not happening yet. As I said, they've had 6 months. Now's the time for them to start getting off of this and start to enact the implementation and additional sanctions that are necessary. And then when you do get to the table, as was noted, then that's what could be traded. But again, it goes back to the other side. We're not going to buy Yongbyon again. They've tried to sell us that multiple times now, but we're smart to their game, and they're going to have to come bigger than that, and they're going to have to be willing to get rid of their nuclear weapons program. And that's the core question for them. Are they ready for that? They were not a couple of years ago. We'll see if they are during this administration.
So part of the challenge for the Biden administration will be to rebuild some of the relationships or re-engage some of the other partners or UN member nations that are key to enforcing sanctions so that they are effective. And so I think what we'll see is the Biden administration trying to rebuild that collaboration and that cooperation on sanctions enforcement. And the big question, of course, is China. Can it get China on board as they did once before in getting China to sign on to some tougher sanctions? I think with China, China did in the past agree to join the U.S. on tougher sanctions, but has since fallen off that campaign. And so it'll be interesting to see whether they're able to bring China, Russia, and other countries back into the fold in terms of some sort of common agreement.
Starting July 18th, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman is visiting Japan, South Korea, and Mongolia. And especially in Japan, she's joined by her Japanese and South Korean counterparts to discuss trilateral cooperation on pressing shared challenges, including regional security issues such as North Korea. Mr. Ruggiero and Ms. Lee, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.